in Parliament.
For Bay of Quinte.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And all political power is a trust, and when the trust is broken, the power is lost. And after 9 years of this Liberal government, the public, Canadians, the people have lost trust in this government. And to break this down, what this debate is for people at home, yes, there is $400 million that was misspent in 186 cases of conflict of interest. Yes, there's accountability that this House demands and answers. And yes, when we looks at the fact that this whole $400 million was supposed to be in creating jobs that Canadians desperately want and need, what it really comes down to this debate today is actually a matter of privilege and trust. And what has happened is the people, first in the committee demanding answers, but then in this House have demanded the documents involved in this case to find answers be submitted to the RCMP. What has happened, in fact, and why we're here, is the government has refused the absolute power of this House to give what the people asked for to where they asked it to be put to, which were documents related to conflict of interest, to the misspending of $400 million, and that money, or those documents, and all the information therein to be given to those who investigated the RCMP. And this debate here in the House is a matter of privilege. It's not about whether we should do the right thing and just send it to committee. It's the fact that the government was asked to do something by the people in the House of Commons, and the government is refusing to do that. And that's the debate we're here today. There's an important quote that says, "The Constitution was created not to protect government from the people, but to protect the people from the government." And when we look at what's at stake here, what's at stake here is accountability. What's at stake here is the power of the House of Commons. What's at stake here is that there is a lack of transparency and trust for all of government, not just the government that's in power. Parliamentary oversight is essential for accountability. The role of Parliament is to hold the government accountable. By refusing to comply with the House of Commons to produce documents, the government undermines this principle and sets a dangerous precedent for evading oversight. You know, Parliament, Madam Speaker, is like the referee of a hockey game. Without it, the government would just trying to score while breaking every rule in the book. Parliament is like the dentist to the government. They don't want to visit, but without it, things would rot fast. Parliament is like Simon Cowell to the government's talent show. They need to hear the truth and the harsh truth, whether they like it or not. And Madam Speaker, Parliament is like your mom checking your room after you cleaned it. The government might think they're off the hook, but Parliament is going to find the mess. That is the power of government, and that's the power of Parliament. We call ourselves His Majesty's loyal opposition, and we take that role very seriously. Is the role, as much as we hear today that the government doesn't like us making videos or talking on social media, that's our job at this point. And yes, we'd love to be in government someday, and we talk to Canadians about what we might do differently. But the role we actually have here today is to hold the government to account and to find the mess. And yes, Madam Speaker, in committees, we find that we work well with other parties when it comes to certain matters, sometimes, Madam Speaker, and when it comes to looking at accountability on this instance, you will find in this House that it's not just the Conservative, it's the NDP and the Bloc members who have all come together who have demanded accountability from the government. To put it into another perspective, for those Canadians at home, well, what does that matter and what does that mean? Well, government's power and Parliament's power is absolute. It's absolute. You can talk about another procedure, you can talk about the Charter, but nothing is more powerful than that absolute right from the House of Commons and the directive from the House of Commons, which means that the House of Commons comes together and asks for documents and they ask for evidence. That means that the government needs to provide those documents and that evidence. It's not a maybe, it's not a can be. To relate this to the government, let's look at what would happen if the CRA came to you and asked for documents for your taxes. And the CRA asks for their financial records, and they ask for your taxes. But instead of complying, you only give them a few documents, or maybe you redact all the documents and say, you know what, I don't want you knowing about this part of my business or this part of my personal life. Well, what would happen? Madam Speaker, there would be fines, penalties, and possible jail time. And to Canadians at home, this House of Commons is the CRA to the government. This House of Commons has the power to ask for documents and has to ensure that the government listens to that directive. You know, there's also respecting the rule of law and parliamentary privilege. The government's refusal to comply with a clear order of the House of Commons violates the rule of law and weakens the democratic process. If Parliament is to maintain its role as a guardian of democracy, it must stand firm. It's asserting its privileges. And today, Madam Speaker, all you hear from the government is, well, just send it to committee. There's a compromise, just send it to committee. And what the matter of that is, Madam Speaker, is if we just send it to committee, we're just delaying this issue down the road. It's already happened, and we're here only because it was delayed down the road. When this first came to light and the order was made, it was back in June 10th, Madam Speaker. June 10th, when this government was asked to hand over to the RCMP what it had in its possession. And I'm just going to go over what was handed and what wasn't handed, because the government does say, well, we handed some government, some organizations, and we have some of this documentation. Well, yes, the Canada School of Public Service, the Canadian Energy Regulator, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Library of Archives of Canada, the Office of Privacy Commissioner, have given full compliance, and there's a few others. Without redactions, with partial delayed compliance with the Department of Finance, Treasury Board Secretariat. And then we have redacted records, Madam Speaker. So the redacted records are documents, but we have a bunch of black on them. Sometimes they're whole sheets that we blacked out. We've got the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, the Business Development Bank of Canada, the Canada Revenue Agency, the Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, the Department of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, the Department of Justice, right? Partial compliance by deadline with one tranche deposited before transmission to the RCMP, another tranche deposited after transmittal, many documents withheld entirely. We have the Department of National Defense, the Department of Natural Resources, but limited scope of production to Directors General and above, Department of Public Works and Government Services, the Department of Western Economic Diversification, Export Development Canada, Federal Economic Development Agency for Southern Ontario, Pacific Economic Development Agency for Canada, the Private Council Office, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, the Standards Council of Canada, the Sustainable Development Technology Canada, the whole organization we're trying to look at, the SDTC. And we had full-out refusal, Madam Speaker, from two departments. Refusal from the government saying we're not getting you any documents, the Communications Security Establishment and the Public Sector Pension Investment Board. Madam Speaker, it was a simple request, and you can see from multiple departments there was never a simple answer, and there was never the documents given back to where they needed to go. You know, the government claiming that handing over unredacted documents would violate the Charter is just an excuse to dodge accountability. Let's be clear, the Charter protects individual rights, not the government's right to hide how it's spent taxpayer dollars. Imagine again if someone being audited by the CRA said, I'm not handing over my documents because it's a violation of my rights. That wouldn't fly. The CRA would demand full transparency because it's about accountability and ensuring no wrongdoing occurred. This isn't a Charter violation, it's about the government trying to cover its tracks. Canadians have the right to know where their money went, and this government can't use the Charter as a shield to avoid answering for potential misuse of public funds. If they really believe in transparency, they should hand over the full documents and let the facts speak for themselves. Madam Speaker, history provides us with lessons on the consequences of defying parliamentary authority. Let's not forget the case of King Charles I, who refused to acknowledge Parliament's rights and authority. His actions led to a constitutional crisis and his eventual downfall. While we live in a very different time, the principle remains the same. When the executive refuses to respect the will of Parliament, it weakens democracy and it erodes the foundations of governance. The government may argue that Parliament overstepped by ordering documents to be handed to the RCMP, but this claim doesn't hold up. Parliament has the power to demand documents from the government, period. The RCMP can review and investigate if needed, but Parliament is tasked with holding this government accountable. In the ruling, Speaker Madam Speaker, the Speaker clearly affirms that the House of Commons has the absolute authority to demand documents from the government without limits, unless it explicitly decides otherwise. The government's argument that sharing these documents with the RCMP oversteps Parliament's authority doesn't hold up under these established rules. The Speaker, Madam Speaker, acknowledged this authority, stating that the motion for the production of documents has already been passed and should have been complied with. However, the Speaker also recommended that the matter be referred to a committee for further study, citing the unusual nature of the order, specifically the fact that it involves sending the documents to a third party. But the suggestion is procedural, Madam Speaker. It is a procedural suggestion. It does not negate the original demand from Parliament. So what we're saying, Madam Speaker, is that we have an absolute right as parliamentarians. We have an absolute right to demand a production of documents, and this government has to produce those documents. And here's why the committee route isn't appropriate also for this case. Parliament already made a clear demand. This came from committee, and referring this issue to a committee is just a way to delay compliance and avoid accountability. The Speaker himself, Madam Speaker, stated this government has not fully complied with the order, and the House has the right to decide whether it is satisfied with the response, not a committee. Delaying it by sending it to a committee is kicking the can down the road, wasting more time instead of giving Canadians the transparency they deserve to know right now. And Canadians, Madam Speaker, have so much pain. Right? When we spend our time in our constituencies, all of us know this, that Canadians right now are having a hard time feeding themselves, housing themselves. They're having a hard time going to the grocery store. You know, these are real issues. You know, I talk routinely about the problems we have just in everyday items that other people across the world can afford, like cell phone bills, right? The average cell phone bill right now in Canada is over $106. And more as Canadians use more data, they're finding their cell phone bills have gone up. TELUS and Bell just announced they're going to increase the rates for international roaming. They're going to increase that again at a time when we already pay the highest fees. They're just finding more ways to get that out of Canadians. And when we talk about other big issues, Madam Speaker, you know, when we look at trade and we look at what's happened in Canada since we've signed CUSMA, the biggest problem is, you know, Canada was kicked out of negotiations for 3 months from the G7 summit when the Prime Minister made comments that were not helping and kicked trade negotiators out. For 3 months, Mexico made a better deal with the Americans. And what has just happened? Well, Mexico is now the Americans' #1 trade partner when it used to be Canada. And that's 2 million jobs. And that is trade and it's paychecks for Canadians. You know, we have a duty in this House, and I think we can all speak as parliamentarians. When we're elected, we all do it for that one why. And my why has always been for my children and others who want to have a better life in Canada. I want a good life for my children, for my grandchildren, to be able to afford a home, to be able to go to the grocery store and afford groceries, to be able to get a good education, get good health care, and to afford to be able to get a good job that pays a good paycheck. And so they can live a life. And I want that for all Canadians. But Madam Speaker, the more we're enthralled in issues that waste taxpayers' money, the more we're enthralled on high taxes, the more that we find issues where Canadians can't find and afford a home, you know, that dream is slipping away for so many Canadians. It's so bad now that Canadians who don't have a home now, their children are probably not going to be able to also afford a home. That's how bad it is. Madam Speaker, today we must reaffirm the supremacy of Parliament and the importance of transparent governance. When this House ordered the production of documents related to the SDTC scandal, it did so to uphold its duty of accountability to Canadians. Parliament's right to demand documents is absolute, and any suggestion otherwise is a dangerous misinterpretation of democratic principles. The refusal to comply is not just an oversight. It is a deliberate obstruction of parliamentary privilege. We must not allow any government to selectively decide which rules to follow. This is not a question of politics. This is a question of preserving the integrity of our democracy and the trust of the citizens who elect us. The argument that sending documents to the RCMP violates the Charter rights of Canadians is deeply flawed. Parliament's order does not dictate what the RCMP should or should not do with the documents. It simply provides them the information necessary to investigate possible wrongdoings. Our role is to ensure that no stone is left unturned when public funds are mishandled, and this government's attempt to block this process cannot stand. Upholding transparency is not a violation of rights, it is the very act of protecting them. The government's refusal to comply with the House order is a challenge to the authority of this Parliament and a direct affront to the principles of democratic oversight. Today, we must make it clear that no government can shield itself from scrutiny and no charter right can be used to hide the truth from the people. Let this House stand firm in its commitment to uphold democracy, transparency, and accountability. For anything less would be an abdication of our duties for Canadians. Parliamentary oversight is essential for accountability. Parliament's right to demand documents is absolute. Respect for the rule of law and parliamentary privilege is the whole premise and duty of us as parliamentarians in this place in the House of Commons. There is no conflict between Parliament and the RCMP. The RCMP can decide to do whatever they like with the documents that are in front of them. Government obstruction is a pattern, Madam Speaker, and this has happened before. This happened the last time in 2021 when we had the National Microbiological Lab and we had two scientists there that needed to be examined. This exact same thing happened, and that resulted in an election. You know, no man is above the law, and no man is below it. Nor do we ask any man's permission, we ask him to obey it, which was a quote by Theodore Roosevelt back in the 1900s. And 100 years later, the same thing holds true. This government is not above the law. This government isn't below it either. Nor do we ask the government's permission when we ask them to obey. These are privileged motions by House of Commons who represent the common people. In this place that we walk in every day and it's green, reminds us, of course, of the people who used to work on the fields. And that place has demanded an answer from this government. And Madam Speaker, for our privilege, for all of us who are parliamentarians here, who represent people back home, people who want accountability and transparency, on behalf of those people, we ask for that privilege to be honored. Thank you, Madam Speaker.